Have you ever wondered what it would be like to run your mix through tubes? Well, wonder no more. That's what we're doing today. I'd like to introduce you to someone. Wabam! The PreSonus ADL 600. The ADL 600 is a 2-channel, aka stereo, tube preamp that sounds really, really good. It's not your typical tube preamp that's super thick and beefy. It's a lot more chill, but it still adds this oomph to the sound. I've used it a ton on acoustic guitar. All my acoustic guitars run through it. I've used it quite a bit on vocal, drum overheads, bass, and maybe a few other things as well. Sadly, PreSonus doesn't make them anymore, but you can still find them on the used market. One thing that always caught my attention about it is that it has a line input on a microphone preamp. So it has an instrument input for bass and guitar, I guess, and then it has different impedances for microphone inputs, but then it also has a line input. And I remember seeing that and thinking, why would I ever need it? And then briefly in the manual, it talked about using it in a mastering chain to add that analog warmth to the signal. And that kind of piqued my interest, but I kind of ignored it. Up until recently, I was sitting down with my buddy Jeremy Casella, and we were talking about his previous album that he did. We actually mixed one of those songs in dueling mixes. And what was cool about the song, it was really, really well produced and had 60 plus tracks in the session. One of the tracks was this delay track. And I didn't know what it was, so I go and solo and listen, and they had taken different pieces of the vocal and run it through some sort of outboard analog delay. I think it was one of those big Moger-Foger delays from Moog. Sounded super, super sweet. I super want one. But it intrigued me. So I asked him about it, and he said the producer, I believe it was Case and Cooley, is really big on taking the signal out of Pro Tools and then running it through different combinations of analog equipment to create different sounds. And that's when the light bulb went off. Wonder what it would sound like to run my mix through this ADL 600. It has tubes. I did a quick Google search and people talked about using it in mastering and mixing to warm up a sterile digital mix. So I had a healthy dose of skepticism, but it's also just sitting right there. Why not try it? So while I was working on my mix for this month's song over at Dueling Mixes, you're a Dueling Mixes member, right? I decided to go for it and run the mix through the ADL 600. Now what's interesting is Studio One, which is the DAW that I use, has a plugin called Pipeline. And it's super cool and actually really simple. I put it at the end of my mastering chain, or the end of the chain of plugins on my mix bus. And then that plugin, just the plugin by itself, has a send and return on it. So I could send the mix out a separate output on my interface, or my mixer, run that into the line inputs of the ADL, bring that back into a separate set of inputs on my mixer, and then select those as the return in the plugin. The end result is the signal gets picked off at the plugin, sent out in the analog world through the ADL 600, then it comes back into the plugin and continues to go down the chain. So I can monitor it through Studio One, and I can even turn the plugin on and off as I'm listening to kind of A/B and see if it's making any difference. Now, enough of that technical mumbo jumbo. Let's go take a listen. Okay, we already have the deck stacked against us a little bit, being that you are listening to this over YouTube or Facebook. But to give yourself a fighting chance, make sure you switch over to HD. The audio quality is better if you're watching and listening in HD. I'll also provide these files. Actually, the files you see in front of you will be in the description below, so you can download them, bring them into your system, and give them a more proper listen. But for now, I'm going to play it for you here and give you an idea of what we got here. So the two tracks here, the bottom one is the analog. That's the one that I ran through the ADL 600. The top is the unanalogued track. So red for warm, blue for ice cold. Only thing you should know is I did time align these as best I could. First thing I want to do is just give you a little taste of the song, and then I want to show you a couple of things, then we'll listen through and go back and forth. I said I got a drink to keep the blood running down to my toes, honey. I said I... Very cool song. Really, really dig it. So one thing that's interesting, if I play both of them at the same time and I flip the polarity of one, which would cancel them out if they're the exact same audio file, here's what you hear. So this is basically what you're hearing is the differences between the two. Now, I don't exactly know what to do with that information, but it's interesting that it's mostly the higher frequencies that are different in some way. I'm going to guess that it's a little bit darker on the analog one, but if you look at the 2 meters here, there's not much to indicate that. They look pretty similar, but they do sound different, which we're going to hear in just a second. So rather than me talking about what you're going to hear, I think that's kind of lame when people do like split tests and A/B tests and they tell you what to listen for, because then you're already automatically biased towards something. I just want you to listen, and I'll let the thing scroll along. And as you watch, the grayed out sections are muted. I'll actually delete them so you can... so it looks a little more obvious. And as it goes along, it's just going to automatically switch back and forth between the two. The top one being the mix without running through the preamp, the bottom one, the mix running through it. And just listen for differences. You can listen to different things. My only suggestion is to maybe listen to the top end for a little bit and then switch and listen to the low end and see if you can hear a difference. If you can't, it's totally fine. It's fairly subtle, but it is there. So without me yammering on anymore, let's take a listen. Every single inch of you, cover every inch of me. I've been second guessing everything I do. Keep you standing next to me. I've been up and out and in between, heaven here, dancing with the devil of a man in me. I need every single loving last stitch of you. Take me to the heaven between. I said I need her. Interesting, right? Is it night and day different? No, but it's interesting. So this time, listen through it again, and specifically, there's 2 things I want you to listen for. Listen to the cymbals, because he's really crashing those cymbals a lot here. In the analog track, I feel like the cymbals are a little less harsh. Everything's a little bit softer on the top end. Still plenty of brightness, but it's a little softer. And then secondly, listen to the bottom end, particularly the bass and the kick drum. It feels to my ears, especially when I listen on nicer headphones, it feels as if there's an extended bass down there. There's like an extra octave of information. And it's more than just something you would get by boosting with EQ, because as you can see on the screen, the EQs are staying pretty much the same, but there's something else there. It's that elusive something else. But I'm hearing it, and I think you'll hear it too in the low end. So I'll do the exact same thing again. This time, listen for those specific things and see what you hear. Every single inch of you, cover every inch of me. I've been second guessing everything I do. Keep you standing next to me. I've been up and out and in between, heaven here, dancing with the devil of a man in me. I need every single loving last stitch of you. Take me to the heaven between. I said I need. Okay, so let me give you my thoughts and impressions, and then I'd love to hear yours in the comments below. For me, it was an interesting difference, and it gave the mix a little more oomph that it didn't have previously. The obvious question, couldn't you do that with some sort of a tape emulation plugin or a console emulation plugin? Yeah, you probably could. And you wouldn't have to deal with the hassle of running it out through there and having to record it back in real time, all that stuff. However, there is something to be said for using a piece of outboard gear in a new creative way. If it gets you excited about mixing and makes you energized and wanting to get down there, get back in the studio and do some more work, to me, that alone is a good enough reason to try something like this. Now, you may not have an ADL 600 lying around, you may not have any tube gear lying around, but you may have something, an old guitar pedal or your guitar pedal board or a guitar amp or an old preamp that's been sitting in the closet, and it might sound really cool to run something through it. Experiment with that stuff. You may accidentally come across a new sound that completely defines the next project that you work on in a really, really cool way. The other big question is, do I see myself using this workflow moving forward? And as of today, the answer is probably not. And here's why. Even today, as I was setting up to shoot this video, I ran some audio through the preamp again, and suddenly the levels were messed up. The left side was way quieter than the right side. Probably some sort of something that needs to be tweaked inside the preamp, because there's a ton of circuits and tubes and other things that I don't understand in there. So if you start being really dependent on a piece of hardware for your sound, you have to keep in mind that that is hardware that can fail. A plugin, on the other hand, doesn't tend to fail because it's not a physical thing. So that's something to keep in mind, which probably enough of a barrier to keep me from doing this consistently. But for something less involved like a mastering session, it might be worthwhile to check out. I don't know. I'm leaning towards probably not, but it was fun, and I think you should try something similar. If you do, come back and leave a comment on this video. I'd love to hear about what you're doing. Final thing, if you like what you hear with this song, you should join Dueling Mixes. This is the song we're mixing this month. You get all the multi-track files, and you can mix to your heart's content. And you can get a 14-day trial for free. So just head over to duelingmixes.com and come check it out.